is really to try and reach out to people within UCL. UCL-TB has been around since about 2014 and was set up really in response to the fact that we thought there was an awful lot of work going on in UCL, largely what we knew was the biomedical stuff, and that there was so much more. We have a view which is summarized in the second two bullet points on the slide here, that we're a TB research network that should be utilizing everything that we see within UCL. We have a mission, which is the statement there, which encompasses both TB and also mycobacterial diseases, such as non-tuberculous mycobacteria. We can list all of the things that we currently do, but you can see that they sort of fall into quite a standard view of what people perhaps do with science and medicine and tuberculosis. But actually, I think that misses the trick hugely. And here, what I'm showing you in this image is the vastness of UCL. Of course, I've made UCL-TB look enormous, but actually how we reach into all of the different faculties within and across UCL. And of course, we have so many partners across the world. And one in particular that I want to highlight is the Africa Health Research Institute, as we are lucky enough to have people from AHRI. Hanekom will be speaking, as you know. So just to focus on biomedicine seems a waste and actually a minimization of what we can really do. So in response to that, and as I was saying in my earlier rather vague preamble, we carried out a survey earlier this year which asked the question, what did people want of UCL-TB and did people even know about it? And the answer was, well, one of the things we'd like to do is actually understand what everybody does within UCL and how we might get to engage better. So here are some of the things that we, UCL-TB, would like to learn. We want you to meet up with each other, and we think that this is quite a good way of doing that. The great advantage, of course, of now is that we're so used to talking on Teams and Zoom, etc., that it's quite simple to do. It's not as good as meeting people face to face, but it's a start. We believe that it's an easy way to engage, and one of the things that we'll try and do is encourage the dissemination of information. We will take notes, and we're also recording the session, if that's okay with you, and so that we can pick up on things and introduce each other as we build up relationships over time. One thing that's really important when we put the morning together was just how impressive what we have at UCL. As you know, this is an internal meeting, so everybody who is attending is linked to UCL in a fairly tight way, whether they're researchers who are based at UCL, whether they have strong research links to UCL, or whether they're healthcare providers working with UCL. And I think you'll see from the range and breadth of what we have, the excellence of what happens in UCL is really, really formidable. One of the other things that we'd like to do is people start to see synergies and think about projects that could be innovative, radical, fascinating going forward. We would also like to know very much what you think of us. One of the things that I haven't really said is, well, what's the purpose of UCL-TB? And of course, what we really want to do is we want to offer you a platform and a structure where you can start to work together, start to feel that there's maybe something that you can identify as being connected to some of the work you do, perhaps in TB or other mycobacterial conditions, and we can start to develop a really strong and powerful network. And of course, like all of these things, if it's not fun, then why do it? And so having fun, I think, is a really key component. You'll have received the outline of the day, and what I wanted to do was just highlight that we've selected people to talk, mainly because we thought what we would do in the first day is try and show some diversity and people who who were happy to sort of put their hands up at this moment when everybody is incredibly busy and actually present. The structure, as you know, is a 5-minute presentation led then by a facilitator who will lead questions either pertinent to the presentations themselves or more general questions. At the end of the morning, Tim McHugh is then going to lead a more general discussion, which will perhaps pick up on what we can do for you and how you would see UCL-TB going forward. One last thing I want to do is just thank the team who've put this together. In particular, Neil Stoker and Eloise Rose, who've been brilliant and had to put up with me, as has Lele Rangaka, who's also part of the UCL-TB delivery group. The other members of the management group who've also been very involved in production of this morning, you'll get to know them all because they're all the facilitators. So that's Maddie, Ibrahim and Tim. So with no more ado, I'd like to introduce our next session, which I think Ibrahim is going to lead. Thank you very much.
I presume that's cue for me to take over, Marc?
It is absolutely, and that's how slick this program is, everybody.
Excellent. Okay, a pleasure to be the facilitator for this first session, experimental approach that we're trying, 5-minute talks, and I will keep to time and interrupt people. But I'm delighted by the eclectic and diverse nature of the list I have. I was trying to think through whether there's any thread that connects them apart from TB, but actually I can't find any. And instead of babbling along for the rest of the 25 minutes, I'm going to just go straight ahead and introduce our first speaker, Jacqui White, who is the clinical team lead for the North Central London TB service, a strong collaborator for TB, and we worked with Jacqui and her team for well over the last decade in various TB studies in London. Jacqui, a pleasure. Take over, please.
Thanks, Ibrahim, and good morning, everybody. And thank you to the organising committee as well for inviting me. I'm honoured to be the first presenter at the first UCL-TB network meeting. I'm Jacqui White and I'm the lead nurse for the North Central London TB network. So I've got 5 minutes now, it might just be 6, to talk to you about TB control in London. So I'll go as quick as I can and I'll summarise some of the headlines and give you some examples from my own network of innovation in order to improve the quality of care and TB outcomes for our patients. So let's look a little bit at what's happening in London at the moment. So TB rates have declined by about 1/3 in the last 5 years. In 2019, we had 1,755 active TB cases. 17% had one or more social risk factor, for example, homelessness, and 23% had a key comorbidity, for example, diabetes. We know this information because TB is a notifiable disease and we collect data on the London TB register, and Public Health England then produce regular reports based on this data to inform TB control. For local service planning and delivery, London is divided into 5 sectors or networks who report into the London TB Control Board. Within the 5 sectors, there are 29 different TB clinics, 8 of which are MDR TB specialist centres. Approximately 10% of cases are drug resistant in the capital, with a small but significant number being multi-drug resistant, about 1 to 2%. So TB care is multidisciplinary, using a case management model delivered by TB nurses, and we work closely with our friends in Public Health England, the local authorities and the third sector. London's implemented some successful initiatives that work across boundaries, tackling TB in the underserved populations. Examples of this are Find and Treat. They're a multidisciplinary specialist outreach team who support local TB services. They actively case find and support patients to take their treatment. We have an accommodation pathway for patients with no recourse to public funds, which secures housing for approximately 25 patients a year for the duration of their treatment. And we have access to virtually observed therapy, or VOT as we call it. VOT was trialled as a centralised model through Find and Treat via the NIHR as a randomised controlled trial, and results have demonstrated it improved treatment outcomes. Patients record themselves taking their medication using a smartphone app, which is uploaded to a server for remote viewing by a trained observer. So this slide talks a little bit about what we do. So in 2015, the collaborative TB strategy was launched as a joint approach by Public Health England and NHS England to tackle TB. The strategy sets out 10 key areas for action, and these are the areas in front of you on the screen. I've just talked about one of these areas and the work that is being done in tackling TB in the underserved. So there's not the time now to drill down into the other 9 areas, but this slide hopefully demonstrates that TB control is not straightforward. There's lots to do in terms of planning, gathering evidence, and collaborating, but these 10 action points have provided a framework for all the agencies involved in TB control to work on evolving and standardising specific, which will continue hopefully to support the decline in TB rates, which we've achieved in recent years. And then thinking a little bit about my TB network, North Central, I thought that I'd share a bit of our work with you. So research and service improvement is very much embedded in what we do in North Central. And over the last decade, we've evolved into a robust clinical network, which provides excellent care with good outcomes. So the following are examples of quality improvement initiatives, most of which are ongoing and all are relevant to the 10 areas of action on the previous slide. Again, I'm just giving you headlines. So in 2010, we implemented the cohort review process, which is a multidisciplinary, systematic quarterly review of the case management and contact investigation of every case of TB. We focus on specific outcomes measured against local and national targets, and the process provides a framework for service evaluation. It's been incorporated into NICE and RCN guidance and has been adopted nationally. It's provided us with sufficient evidence to transform service delivery and also some aspects of the care. More recently, we've developed the concept of diagnostic coding. So to better understand the diagnostic process, we've introduced a simple diagnostic certainty score to ascertain how secure the diagnosis of TB is. Results show that extrapulmonary TB increases the likelihood of diagnostic uncertainty. We're routinely doing a mortality audit on all TB-related deaths. So over a 2-year period, the majority of deaths occurred in people with comorbidities, and findings showed that TB often contributes to rather than causes death. TB incident management, in congregate settings. This can be an enormous workload resulting in a small yield of infection and active disease. So we developed a dedicated TB nurse screening role who provides a systematic standardised approach when assessing non-household contacts, and this has led to improved data quality. And findings show that 50% of reported TB incidents required no further assessment, so we can now look at refining our current approach and target TB incidents that are more likely to result in TB infection or active disease. We know that TB outcomes in those with social risk factors is associated with worse treatment outcomes. We're fortunate enough to have a social care team in my network who are able to support social care needs. We've looked at data over 2.5 years of patients who were and were not referred to the social care team, and we were able to demonstrate improved treatment completion in patients who receive social care support. And finally, case management dependencies. So case numbers are declining, but becoming significantly more complex. We have an appropriate workforce with the expertise required. We're collating case management dependency levels using a grading system which assesses the medical, nursing and social care input required during a patient's treatment. This work helps to ensure a consistent approach to TB case management with appropriate staffing levels and skill mix. So I'll stop there, except to say that in the last 6 minutes, I haven't mentioned COVID, but it's fair to say that the pandemic has put a spanner in the works in terms of TB control in London. But I think that we've got the show back on the road and we've now settled into a new normal. So let's see what happens to TB rates in the coming months. And if you require any further information, because there's lots to talk about, please contact me. I'm very happy to speak to anyone, or if they would like to come and visit us within our TB service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. That was excellent. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Francois Balloux, the director of the UCL Genetics Institute. And we're moving from clinical to proper biology. Frank, I haven't seen you in quite a while. Hope you're keeping well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's wonderful to meet you again. Meet you all. So yes, I'll talk about something slightly different. I'll talk about bedaquiline, and I'll give maybe a bit of flavor of what we're doing before I really talk about some recent, I think, exciting and important results. Okay, so my group is very computational, and we work on a series of bugs. I won't talk about COVID today, obviously, but let's say I'll talk about TB because we have an active TB program. And we are particularly working on using genomic information to either infirm on the epidemiology, but very generally, our key interest is dating the emergence and spread of resistance mutations in TB. And I'll just show you a tree we produced a few years ago. This is it's an L2 lineage, and you have the phylogenetic tree here, which is well resolved. And the way we produce our trees, we have information about the date of sampling, which allows us to calibrate these trees. So essentially the branch length, they mean something in terms of time. So we can say something about these nodes. And what really interests us often is to say something about these nodes when a node leads to a series of branches that share the same resistance mutation. So for instance, if we take this example here, we have
Francois,
spectacular.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Francois. We're seeing a bioarchive figure rather than a PowerPoint slide.
So
Great.
can you see title slide? Okay, so I'll go very quickly through that. I'll go back to my little tree, which is a tree of an L2 lineage. And what I was trying to point to is this clade, subclade in particular, and they all share one specific mutation. And because the way we build these trees, they are so-called time trees, we can infer the date of the age of that node, which corresponds to a hypothetical ancestor, and that gives us some information about the emergence of a specific mutation, because TB doesn't recombine, and if all these share a specific mutation, then it emerged in this ancestor in all likelihood. So you can say, in a given place, in a given lineage, we had this mutation that emerged at a given time. And we've done that for several situations, for several drugs. And very generally, the take-home message, which is pretty sad, is that the emergence of mutations generally follows quite immediately the introduction of the drug in a given setting. And that's been true essentially for every drug we've looked at. Now, recently, we've been working a lot on bedaquiline with Camis Nemo and my colleague Lucy Van Dorp. And I'll just show you some very recent results, which are still in preprint stage. We compiled a very, very large data set, partly some of our own sequences, I should say, mostly Louis Grandjean's sequences, but some other sources. And we also went through databases with some new tools to look specifically for genomes that carried mutations in RV0678, and which is a gene, whenever it's disrupted, essentially, it leads to resistance to bedaquiline. Resistance to bedaquiline is quite complicated phenotypically, talk about that, but let's say these mutations, there are some, we're very confident they provide resistance to bedaquiline. And we compiled a huge data set, and when we just look at the sampling date of this data and whether we have resistance or not, we already see something surprising. We see that actually we have resistant samples that predate the use of bedaquiline. Actually, they also predate the use of clofazimine. So how is this possible? And we looked into that in more detail. So we're building these big trees, and we're looking at the multiple emergencies in different parts of the world. So all the ones here are red, in red are resistant. We're very confident they're resistant, and we find them both in lineage 2 and lineage 4. Now, where it really becomes surprising is actually that some of these resistances, at least we infer that these resistances have been around for quite a while. And actually, for instance, in lineage 4, we have resistant lineages that we believe have emerged in the early 18th century, and they're not so rare, particularly in South America. We also see some in South Africa. So essentially, to summarize, there is a pre-existing reservoir of bedaquiline resistance, and bedaquiline resistance have been emerging more frequently since the use of bedaquiline, possibly clofazimine, but it's more unlikely. We don't see any suspicion that azoles might also lead to cross resistance. But there's a real issue here, because even before the acronym was actually used, there were low frequency resistant mutants, and they're going up in frequency. So I think that's an extremely serious problem, and we have to brace ourselves for these lineages going up in frequency in the near future, in all likelihood. If you want,
so how many more do you have? We have a minute, I believe.
No, that's it. That's it. It's just if you want to see a bit more, and it's some kind of form of acknowledgement slide. All the people who worked in that, there's also a bit of machine learning to predict the importance of different mutations, which is, I think, something new that might interest some of you. Okay, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks, Francois. So if you can remove the sharing.
Oh,
yes. Yeah, we did see Dr. Who as well. Excellent.
Perfect. Fantastic.
Is doing well. While you're shutting down, let me introduce our next speaker, and we move from biology to English. Delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor John Mullan, the head of English, who has also an enviable chair title of the Lord Northcliffe Chair of Modern English Literature. John?
One of the refreshing things I've discovered already today is that medical boffins are as inept as members of the arts and humanities faculty at mastering this new technology. We always assume that scientists know how to do things, but anyway. Okay, so TB in literature, I'm going to talk about very briefly. Why should literary critics, literary historians be interested in TB? I mean, one answer might be, of course, that lots of writers had tuberculosis, and lots of famous writers died of it, actually. Franz Kafka, George Orwell, Emily and Anne Bronte, maybe Charlotte Bronte, the jury's a bit out on that one. D.H. Lawrence, Chekhov, John Keats. But actually what I want to talk about in my brief few minutes is how TB actually has shaped literature, how it gets into literature, and actually even how some writers rather creatively take advantage of it and use it and almost, dare I say it, relish it. Here's an 18th century novelist, Laurence Sterne, Tristram Shandy, a great novel, a great sort of mockery of learning, including, I'm afraid to say, medical learning. And I recommend it to all of you if you haven't sampled it. And its author, Sterne, who indeed battled tuberculosis much of his life and eventually died of it. And his novel came out in effect, installments across some 7 years. And in between installment 3 and installment 4, his tuberculosis became much worse, and he had to travel to France, to the south of France, or he thought he did, for 3 years, which interrupted the publication of his novel. And it's an autobiographical novel, and tuberculosis is in the novel all the time. He is flying from death, and when he got back to England and produced a new chunk of Tristram Shandy, it opened as if in conversation with a reader who was saying, why haven't I been having my installments for the last 3 years like this? No, I think I said I would write 2 volumes every year, provided the vile cough which then tormented me and which to this hour I dread worse than the devil would but give me leave. And these 2 volumes that he publishes now send the character Tristram, who is a sort of alter ego of the novelist, and the reader off to France. And this is why. When death himself knocked at my door, ye bade him come again. Ye is the spirit of life in him. And in so gay a tone of careless indifference did ye do it, that he doubted of his commission. There must certainly be some mistake in this matter, quoth he, death. Now there is nothing in this world I abominate worse than to be interrupted in a story. And as I was at that moment telling Eugenius, his friend, a most tawdry one in my way, of a nun who fancies herself a shellfish, and of a monk damned for eating a mussel, this is all suggestive 18th century stuff, I'm afraid, and was showing him the grounds and justice of the procedure, did ever so grave a personage get into so vile a scrape, quoth death. Death is, as it were, the spirit of TB. "Thou hast had a narrow escape, Tristram," said Eugenius, taking hold of my hand as I finished my story. "But there is no living, Eugenius," replied I, "at this rate. For as this son of a whore has found out my lodgings," he goes. He must leave. He goes to France, and the novel goes with him. Had I not better fly for my life, Eugenius? So the life of his narrative of Tristram Shandy, the novel, is written against death, against the TB that pursues him. And this sense that TB gives a writer an acute sense of the limitedness of time. Here's another example of that a bit later. This is John Keats in 1820, recorded by his friend Charles Armitage Brown. "Bring me the candle, Brown, and let me see this blood." After regarding it steadfastly, it's blood on his pillow. He looked up in my face with a calmness of countenance that I can never forget and said, "I know the colour of that blood. It is arterial blood. I cannot be deceived in that colour. That drop of blood is my death warrant. I must die." And that sense actually not just haunts, but actually infuses his poetry. Here is a very famous example from a year earlier. He'd nursed his brother Tom earlier in 1818, who had died of TB, and perhaps Keats had caught it from him. And the next year, one of his most famous poems muses, of course, on the call of easeful death. And that's the peculiarity of TB in the creative minds of lots of writers, that it is a dread disease, as Dickens's narrator says in Nurse Nickleby, which prepares its victim, as it were, for death, which so refines it of its grosser aspect and throws around familiar looks unearthly indications of the coming change. And the strange thing is how in 19th century literature, TB often, as it were, makes the characters otherworldly, removes them from the trivial concerns of this life. Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. In this novel, Smike. In Dombey and Son, Paul Dombey, the child. And finally, my last slide, in another Victorian novel, Jane Eyre's bosom friend at the ghastly Lowood School, Helen Burns, who thinks of better things. She reads the Bible and Dr. Johnson, instead of raging against the injustice of life like the heroine. And here she is, the night of her death. "I am very happy, Jane, and when you hear that I am dead, you must be sure and not grieve. There's nothing to grieve about. We all must die one day, and the illness which is removing me is not painful, it is gentle and gradual. My mind is at rest. I leave no one to regret me much. I've only a father, and he is lately married and will not miss me. By dying young, I shall escape great sufferings. I had not qualities or talents to make my way very well in the world. I should have been continually at fault." It's convenient for the writers who want to kill off their characters for particular reasons, but also, strangely enough, it's a weird kind of privilege to suffer from TB so often in the literature of the 18th and 19th century. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Excellent. So unfortunately, due to the superb technological skills of our clinical and lab colleagues, we actually only have about, I'd borrow 3 minutes from the next session from Willem and colleagues, and have 5 minutes of discussion. Does anybody want to have a first go of asking any of our speakers or all of them a question? No?
Can I ask?
Right, Maddie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask John a question about TB. It's striking how the extent to which writing about TB seemed to be a normal part of life in the examples you gave. But at some point, of course, since then, TB has become a very stigmatizing condition, which is not considered to be a normal part of life. I wonder whether that came through in the literature over time, about when that transition took place.
Yeah, that's a good question to which I don't know the answer. I've no idea. But I mean, my thesis, which I would have to test, is that TB becomes stigmatizing almost at the point at which it becomes curable or treatable. I mean, it's still, you know, you might know, you know, in the early 20th century, Thomas, you know, in the age of sanatoria, Thomas Mann's great novel, The Magic Mountain, the protagonist is sent to the sanatorium for TB, where he encounters sort of representatives of every sort of class and nation in Europe. And you know, at that stage, TB is not stigmatizing. You know, it's almost something that a kind of reflective and philosophical person who's got lots of long books to read might benefit from. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I have a hypothesis, and it would be interesting to find out the answer.
Thank you.
So perhaps one for our historian colleagues to set out and answer that hypothesis with you. Excellent. Marc, did you have a question? If not, I have one for Francois.
No, you go ahead and ask, please.
Right. So, Francois, I just was curious about the implications of your finding that these mutations predated essentially the use of these antibiotics on the discovery and use of future agents to treat. Can we essentially, while the compounds are being developed, actually determine whether there is a likelihood of resistance in the way you've done?
Yes, I think the consequence is that I think programmatic testing needs to be deployed as soon as possible. Otherwise, I really worry that bacterial resistance will go up very, very quickly, and which is obviously deeply depressing. The other, I would say, possibly fairly bad news, and this is not completely surprising, but these bedaquiline mutations, they arise very, very easily in the sense that anything that disrupts RVO 678 actually does the job. So there's a huge mutational target, but even more disappointingly, they seem to have very little fitness cost, because if they emerged hundreds of years ago and are still in circulation, not necessarily very high frequency, but in circulation at reasonable frequency, this just is not compatible with these mutations, have a strong fitness cost for the bug. So I think the situation is actually a bit more severe than I had anticipated.
Thanks for that, Francois. Given that we only have 2 minutes and there are 2 people to ask questions, Marc and Neil, and they are the organizers of this event, can I start with Neil and then go to Marc? 30 seconds each.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Jacqui, of all the things that are going on at the moment in your TB control program, what do you think is the thing that you're finding most difficult, or that you think needs addressing most?
That's a difficult question at the moment, because it has to be COVID. This year, it's been about trying to maintain a TB service, and it's been trying to recover the TB service following the first few months of COVID, and trying to get across the point that TB control is equally as important as COVID control, and that we mustn't divert resources away from TB control, and that whatever happens, we have to maintain a TB workforce who can continue to do what we do. And so I could go on forever, but I know I have to stop. But things like access to services has been a big issue, because the public are told to keep away from hospital, people can't access their GP, they don't want to go to A&E. So yeah, a whole plethora of issues around COVID this year, and no doubt that will be ongoing into next year. So yeah, it's been a challenge and will continue to be. So it's so important that services remain accessible, so important that that people still present to us and that we can still find our cases of TB.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. Marc, I'm really sorry, but I think we've run out of time. I've used up the 3 minutes, in which case I should be handing over to our next session. And I think that would be Professor Willem Hanekom, the director of AHRI.
Yeah, absolutely. So
you want to introduce Willem?
I will indeed. So back to me. That was really terrific. And as has been pointed out, technology baffles and scientists don't know everything. It's a huge pleasure now to welcome Willem Hanekom, who's director of AHRI, a clinician scientist with extensive experience of tuberculosis vaccinology, which is obviously very much in the news at the moment. And Willem has kindly agreed to give us an overview of AHRI and TB. There'll be 10 minutes for discussion following his presentation. Willem, welcome to the morning here at UCL-TB.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be here and to tell you a little bit about AHRI. Let me just share my slides. AHRI has been in existence for about 20 years in various iterations here in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And recently we went ahead and we had a complete relook at the organization and its science, etc., and we developed a new strategy. And the new strategy has a vision that says optimal health and well-being of under-resourced populations. So this is a picture taken in the area that we work in northern KwaZulu-Natal. Relatively poor, in fact, one of the poorest areas in South Africa. And then our mission to get to that vision is to do transdisciplinary scientific research to understand and then intervene in the health and well-being of South African communities. So again, this is a picture taken in our lab in the Durban area. So the site, the rural site that we have is very close to the Mozambican border in KwaZulu-Natal, whereas our urban site in Durban is at the medical school here. So here we've got, in total, we've got about 520 people that are doing research work here. And these are what our facilities look like. On the left, you can see the building that we are in at the medical school. And on the right, you can see the building in the rural area. So what is our real value proposition? Because that's really what we had to do to define and respond to during the strategy development process. And I think it's pretty clear that we're doing research in various areas along the research value chain. We've got a massive population focus, but also doing social science, clinical science, and a very strong basic science research here in the Durban area. So linking all this, I think, is the unique value proposition. And linked to that are incredibly valuable cohorts that have been generated over the years. And because we have a health and demographic surveillance site, part of a network of such sites in South Africa, we've got massive cohorts, massive amounts of data surrounding HIV, TB, NCDs, etc., and various cohorts nested within that, but also cohorts in the Durban area with large biobanks of human specimens. So everything that we do starts with the human. I think the other proposition that we have in terms of what we have to respond to is that we are in an area with an incredibly high HIV prevalence and incidence. So here you can see the incidence in different geographic areas within our demographic surveillance site. And you can see there are 3 hotspots, for example. But overall in KwaZulu-Natal, about more than 30%, more than 35% of people in KwaZulu-Natal are HIV infected. In our area, in certain populations of women, there's 70% of persons that are HIV infected. So we are a department within the Division of Infection and Immunity, and how this has come about is that 1/3 of our funds come from the Wellcome Trust as an Africa-Asia program, and the home, and this flows via UCL, and the home at UCL is community. But we've got a huge involvement also then with basically Ibrahim's institute. So this is not really about data, but just to give you an overview of what we do. So at our health and demographic surveillance site, we've followed about 120,000 people for 20 years already. And you can see from this graph that there are some changes that are happening over time. These are mortality rates in this area, and you can see a dramatic decrease in mortality rates, especially in the light blue surrounding HIV. So within that demographic surveillance site, we did a cross-sectional study called Vukuzazi, which means know yourself in isiZulu, and basically looked at multi-morbidity, not just at single diseases within these populations. And on the graphs, you can see, according to age on the x-axis and percentage on the y-axis, and left females and right males, you can see in red that what percentage of the population have multimorbidity. You can see overall more than 20% of the population have more than one uncontrolled disease. And if you can, in terms of controlled disease, huge numbers of people have disease. So we have incredible detail about this. If one then looks at TB within this Vukuzazi cohort, you can see extraordinarily high rates of incident TB, which was diagnosed in this cross-sectional evaluation. And the interesting thing about this is that more than half of these people that were diagnosed with TB were undiagnosed when this cross-sectional survey happened, and had either very mild symptoms or didn't know that they had symptoms. So TB is a massive problem in this rural community. If one looks at lifetime tuberculosis and look at different ages on the x-axis, you can see that if you are 65 and over and you are a male, that you have more than 45% chance of having TB over a lifetime in this area. And on the right, you can see the areas in which the TB are more common. And perhaps this is no surprise. This might come as no surprise to people that the area on the left that is red is an area where there is a new coal mine, or the coal mine has been there for the last 10 years or so. So lots of interventions are obviously being tested, many on a programmatic level. And this is, for example, one study of Alison Grant's that is ongoing, that looks at prevention and what the best strategies would be for prevention by looking at various components that are important for us to actually get to better strategies and then inform our colleagues in the health department of these outcomes. In fact, that links then to the new strategy that we've developed, and by definition, a health and demographic surveillance site is very descriptive. And what we want to move to is more interventions. So these are clinical trials of for example, drugs or vaccines or diagnostics. So experimental products, but also implementation science is going to get a much greater focus in the future. And in fact, in the future, we feel that within our local environment, where a lot of HIV research is happening already, that we will have a bigger focus on TB in the future. But overall, actually, our focus is changing. If you think back about our vision and mission, and that we want to now start looking at things from a population lens rather than from an individual disease lens, and perhaps still having an emphasis on disease, but also on health and well-being. So this disease emphasis will continue, and I wanted to just show one slide of the incredible work that's happening in the basic science labs here, for example. Again, always starting with human tissue. So these are resected lungs from where these were clinically indicated in the Durban area, and we've got large biobanks of these, where Audrey Stein and his colleagues did various omic analyses and identified new pathways that may be important for control of tuberculosis when compared to healthy lung tissue. And basically, if you use Prozac, and then looked at which drugs might affect these pathways. And here you can show that Prozac is synergistic with rifampin in an in vitro granuloma model, just to assess the effects on NTB growth. This is just shown in much greater detail here. So I have to conclude by saying that, of course, we're also in the middle of a huge coronavirus epidemic. And unfortunately, it looks like we are entering our second wave, as it's called. And you may be aware of these results that have now been published in clinical infectious diseases from Cape Town, where associations with mortality were assessed with using massive databases that are available in the Western Cape. So, for example, here it's been shown that previous tuberculosis has an adjusted hazard ratio of 1.4 for death, and as current tuberculosis 2.6. So this kind of work is being evaluated, obviously, in our setting, and I'm going to skip that, to assess exactly what the effect of COVID is going to be, both on a population basis and also in the lab. So I want to end there. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to ask questions. I also would welcome questions to my colleagues who are on the line also with me.
Willem, thank you so much indeed. Really great, and I like very much, of course, as a clinician as well, the idea that it all starts with people. I've been texted by Neil to say that it is maybe difficult for people to ask questions. I just want to check. Let's see if people have questions, and if they can't speak, if they can type them, and I'll check the chat function. So, any questions for Willem?
Marc, the chat was that they can't chat.
I'm sorry, one of you, please.
So I'm just saying that the point is they can't write in the chat. That's what's not working.
Okay, can they speak if they wish to?
Yeah.
Excellent. Maybe I'll start. Willem, the strategy thing, people often say, yes, you know, we all need a strategy. And of course, that's partly one of the reasons that we're having the day today here for UCL-TB, because there's a mission statement and then there's actually what we do and how we achieve it. You're in a place where the numbers are just overwhelming. I mean, as you say, a 60-something% risk of someone developing tuberculosis, 70% of female population with HIV co-infection. How do you manage that? Where do you start from when developing a strategy?
Yeah, so I think I should have emphasized, Marc, that the strategy is for our institute. So because we are an independent institute, we're an independent company in South Africa, and we have a board, and we have the luxury of having a strategy as an institute of what we're going to focus on and how we're going to do things. It's slightly, although we're academic, it's slightly different from the classical academic environment. So then the question that you ask is, where do you start with these incredible numbers? And I think this has to have a multidisciplinary approach, and I cannot go into all the details of this at the moment, but really say that the success that we've shown, for example, in the reduction of the mortality in at our demographic surveillance site, especially HIV-related mortality, is an example of how these multidisciplinary approaches actually do work in the end. I think our TB effort affords an incredible opportunity right now. Now that we've just described how much TB there is, and especially how much asymptomatic TB there is, and so this is the effort of a huge new focus in which we will look at early next year.
Thank you, Maddie. I think you've got a question.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, Willem. Really interesting overview. And I think you just sort of mentioned it at the end of your answer just now, but I was really struck by the amount of prevalent TB you were able to detect in the Vukuzazi study. I'm sorry if I missed it, but it wasn't clear to me how much of that was symptomatic and how much of it was truly asymptomatic, and how you went about, actively finding those cases in that study.
Yeah, so in the Vukuzazi cohort, there was obviously algorithms in which people were assessed, and if there were symptoms, this triggered various algorithms. So most people that are described there as having active TB would have had a sputum and would have had a chest X-ray. All right. So even if they were very, very mildly symptomatic, and that's how this was picked up. So I think overall, amongst our cohort, about 60% were asymptomatic that we picked up, and that had disease. So there's an investigator here called Emily Wong, who you may know, who calls this subtle TB, but really what this is either asymptomatic TB or TB with very mild symptoms, so mild that the participants or the patients would not actually seek care. And really, we do not know much about this. We do not know how to pick this up, and whether there could be transmission that happens from those patients.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. Lele, question. You're on mute at the moment. Excellent.
Hello, Willem.
Hey, Lele.
Hi. So thank you so much for telling us a little bit about the Vukuzazi. I don't know if Emily is on the line. Obviously, she can take the question as well. And I was intrigued, obviously, seeing that you have obviously looked at NCDs, in the Vukuzazi cohort. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about maybe some of the patterns of multimorbidity/TB that you saw, and maybe tell us a little bit about the strategy going forward and studying this sort of intersection a little bit more.
Yeah. So Lele, good question. Emily is not on the line, unfortunately, but I may have alluded to it, but we're going to have a little Lakota early next year, a little meeting to actually discuss exactly what the new questions should be following these Vukuzazi results. There's already a small sub-studies ongoing. You may know that there's a specific study that's going on to look at NCDs and how prevalent they were, and even how much of what we call TB may have been in bovis, for example, because of the diagnostic approaches that one uses as a routine. There are studies that are ongoing looking at tobacco associations. I really want to look at that mine and what that does, in terms of tuberculosis, whether these were miners or whether these were people who just live in the environment of the mine, for example. There's many little projects that are starting up, but I think what we need is a comprehensive approach in response and seeing how we're going to take those results further. We're not going to do any more enrollments for Vukuzazi. That cross-sectional enrollment is now finished, and we're going on to new studies. And of course, as you know, we want to have interventions too. So apart from Vukuzazi, I hope that we will ultimately be able to bring interventions to that area to be able to test them.
Great. And I guess maybe offline we'll be following up to see how perhaps some of us within UCL-TB can work much more closely with Emily and team. That would be really great.
That would be fantastic. Thanks.
All right then.
Any other questions? If not, I'm going to say, Willem, thank you so much. I mean, the synergies are so apparent between what happens in London and Jacqui White's presentation and what you're encountering on a very much larger scale. As Lele was commenting about the NCDs, about the impact of the mines, as you were saying, and we see very similar issues. Obviously, no mines, but just the massive social impact that we've had to adjust to actually try and manage tuberculosis, which people tend to think of as a medical condition. I'm going to suggest that we have a 10-minute break now, so time to get a cup of coffee, go to the loo, whatever, and then rejoin when Lele will be leading the next session, 3 speakers, and again, as you can see, quite intense with the questioning, and hopefully it's all fun. Do let us know how things are going. Great, see you in 10 minutes.
Welcome back. So we have 3 talks lined up, and yeah, each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes discussion. The first speaker, hello, Rob.
Hi, Lele.
Medicine, School of Pharmacy. You can give a little intro of who you are as well in your talk. Please, you can start now.
Thanks, Lele. I'll just share screen if I can make the tech work. Yeah, okay. So here we go. So, hi everybody. My name is Rob Horne. I'm Professor of Behavioural Medicine at the Centre for Behavioural Medicine in the UCL School of Pharmacy. And what we do is creating new knowledge, tries to make healthcare more efficient and sustainable by understanding and addressing the psychosocial and behavioural barriers that explain variation in response to treatment. So our interest is really in 2 things. What do we mean by that? Well, there are 2 streams of research. The main one, in terms of grant income, is around the behaviours that determine sort of how well a treatment works, and particularly patient behaviour in terms of uptake, and adherence to treatment, but also we have some studies looking at doctors' behaviour, and the amazing early insights from that research is that doctors show many of the traits of humans when it comes to behaviour. So, you know, sort of the same approaches that we can use to understand patients can also be applied when we're trying to look at things like prescribing from the perspective of doctors. And then we also look at how psychosocial factors influence the direct effects of treatment through non-specific effects. That's like placebo and nocebo effects of active treatment. So how psychology influences how well an active treatment works. But what we're doing 2 studies. We work across sort of long-term conditions, and we work with various clinical teams, and there are 2 studies that we're involved in TB. One is RID-TB, which is looking at how we can improve the detection and treatment of latent TB, and our contribution to that, which is delivered by 2 postdoctoral research fellows within the group. There's Dr. Amy Clark and Dr. Alex Ganuni, who are both of whom are on the line, I think. And this study is a really big NIHR program grant with PIs are Lele and Ibrahim. And what we're looking at there is, you know, it's a whole program of work to basically understand what's the best way to test and treat latent TB. And our role in this program is to help to develop an intervention to optimize adherence once patients start on the treatment, and just sort of help with the behavioral aspects of the program. It's a similar picture with the impact study, which looks at TB rather than latent TB, and that's led by Marc Lipman, and our postdoc on that one is Annie Jones, who actually can't join us today. So those are the studies. What we're basically doing in them is applying a simple framework to try and understand TB from the perspective of the patients and the factors that will influence each individual's motivation and ability to take the treatment. So it's kind of taking a 360 look at the patient's perspective of TB and TB treatment. So I'll sort of stop there. I think I've had my 5 minutes and make way for somebody else. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. You had a couple of minutes still left, but I think that's saving us time for later. So we can just move on to Matt. Matt, please introduce yourself as well.
Hi there. I'm Matt Todd. I'm trying to get a handle on what I'm supposed to be sharing here. Hopefully that is that's a slide and it looks all right.
Yep.
And then if I do that, it still looks all right?
Still looks all right. We're still waiting for the slide sort out one. Okay,
that's good. That's fine. You can see?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I just downloaded the app today, so that's... all right. Nice to be here. I'm Matt Todd. I'm Professor of Drug Discovery, also in the School of Pharmacy. I have an interest, as some of you know, in development of small molecule medicines using an open source approach. And what I mean by that is that it's a bit like Wikipedia. Everything's available online freely in real time, and anybody can participate as it goes along. So it's very participative. And what that means is there's no patent protection and so on. And we've been doing this for a while now, mostly with malaria, where lab notebooks are online and there's discussion between people online. And we as the sort of social result of that has been a lot of inputs from people who give to the project, ranging from school children through to fully paid up professionals in the pharma industry. As I'll show you, that we've been doing some of that in TB. So as an example, in a malaria project, we needed these 3 molecules, and we advertised that fact. A student who was finishing up a PhD in Edinburgh decided to make one, did that independently of us and shared all the data, and then mailed the compounds that he'd made to a biology lab and got some important data and became an author on the paper that we published. And we only met him, a year or so later. So this kind of distributed effort is quite easy if everything is online, so there's no outsiders. And we've applied this mainly to malaria, also to a fungal infection called mycetoma with DNDi. And most of the time in the last year has been spent on an antibiotics project, actually 2 antibiotics projects. But I'll just mention a couple of things we've done on TB. One series we published a couple of years ago was a kind of open project with GlaxoSmithKline based at Tres Cantos in Spain. But a beautiful set of compounds, really nice, and we published it. But we didn't quite get the open source thing working because GSK required a little bit of time for the lawyers to check the molecules we were making. So even though it was very promising, we didn't quite show the sort of community input that we wanted. And then more recently, with Tim McHugh and Joanna Bacon, we've been looking at these molecules, which have a sort of sniff of activity against latent TB, non-replicating TB. And we've been working with Tim and now more recently with Joanna to try to prove the mechanism of action, or prove that they do have this activity, and what we can do with these molecules going forward. Remarkably simple structures and really interesting to look at. And of course, we're interested to see if they have a novel mechanism of action. Other things that we've done in recent years, just to highlight, are some fluorescent molecules, which have promising anti-TB activity, and which showed promise in a zebrafish model of infection. We've kind of stalled that because the project ran out of money, but very nice molecules to work with and lots of possibilities for changing the structures. The most recent thing, as I said, we've been spending most of our time on antibiotics project in the last couple of years, which is why we haven't moved on some of these TB series so much in the last year or two. But interestingly, the big project in the open source antibiotics area is the MER ligase project. And we've got a number of different ways forward here. Of trying to find inhibitors for these antibiotic enzymes, including fragment approaches and contributions on the bottom there from a company, Pro Bono, as well as a more recent structure that's just been published of an old AstraZeneca compound in complex with one of these enzymes. And the reason I mention them is because these enzymes are also particularly important for TB. And I know there's already interest in UCL on these enzymes. So I'm really hoping that maybe some of the things we do for the antibiotics project could be repurposed for TB. What we want to do with this is try and get a group of us together to go after some funding for a bunch of projects that investigate small molecules for the treatment of tuberculosis using novel mechanisms of action. And I can talk to anybody about this idea of getting a few of us together to try and seek a sort of more platform funding type approach to pushing on some of this research. Just very quickly to mention that this is not just of academic interest. Also been working quite hard with a bunch of people to show that molecules that are in the public domain and are unpatented can be protected, can be taken through development, through clinical trials to market, using a mechanism we call using regulatory data exclusivity. And I can talk to anybody about this if you want to. We founded a little company in London last year to try to take open assets through trials to patients in the absence of any intellectual property protection. And I'll stop there. That's just some people who've done some work on these projects. Thanks particularly to Tim and Joanna, who I think are on the line, who have worked on some of these molecules.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. Right on time.
All right.
Angela, you're up next. And I would also appreciate if you could just give a little introduction, Angela.
Hi, I'm going to do this right. I'll just share my screen. Has that worked?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. So, and thanks, Lele. So, yes, I'm Angela Crook, a statistician, and I've worked at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit since 2007, before the unit joined UCL in 2013. And I'm the statistical lead for the TB trials. So at UCL then, MRC CTU sits within the Institute of Clinical Trials and Methodology, ICTM, and that's within the Faculty of Population Health Sciences. So in the unit, TB trials fall under the Respiratory Infections Programme, and this programme brings together the paediatric trials, trial logo shown on the left, and the adult trials on the right, in TB, pneumonia, flu, and then now also COVID-19. But today I'm going to focus on one paediatric TB trial, SHINE, shown here with the Sunny Smile logo, and where the results of this trial were recently presented at the Union World Conference in Lung Health, which was a virtual conference, sadly, and not in sunny Seville that had been planned. So before I talk about SHINE, though, I'm just going to say a little bit more about TB trials at MRC CTU. Traditionally, these are focused on shortening treatment, as the majority of patients with TB do well with 6 months of standard anti-TB drugs. But poor adherence and increased drug resistance means that new, simpler, shorter regimens are needed. And more recently, the unit has moved into working in TB prevention, particularly the RID-TB trial that Rob was telling you about just a bit earlier, and the treatment of early disease. And then the map on the right shows the global nature of our work. With these are the clinical trial sites around the world. Okay, so back to SHINE. This was the first large international TB treatment trial in children, and the use of 6 months of standard therapy in children is a result of extrapolating results from the adult trials in TB. But most children present with less severe disease, so it's not unreasonable to think that they could be safely treated with a shorter treatment duration. So between 2016 and 2018, SHINE recruited over 1,200 children under 16 from 5 sites across Africa and India. So that's within Zambia, Uganda, South Africa, and 2 sites in India. And they were randomly allocated to either 4 months or 6 months control treatment of standard TB drugs. And they were followed up for 72 weeks for primary outcome assessment. So this bar chart shows the schema of the two arms, demonstrating the difference in between the arms is just this reduction in 2 months of treatment on continuation phase for the intervention arm. And of note, all children received 8 weeks intensive phase of the 4 drugs. And we used the at the time with the new pediatric dispersible fixed dose combination drugs with the revised WHO recommended weight bandings dosing. So in the interest of time, I am actually just going to go straight to the results of the primary efficacy results. And this plot shows the risk difference with this grey line here around 0 for the main analysis populations, which I won't go through, but they are showing consistent results, and just want to focus on the primary result within the red box. And the grey line at 0, as I said, shows no difference between in terms of unfavourable outcome, which is death, TB treatment failure or recurrence, between the 4 and the 6 month allocated treatment durations. And the upper bound of the confidence interval around this difference is at 1.6, which is well below the 6% pre-specified margin of non-inferiority, which is a statistical term for how we define what we mean as good as. So with only 3% on each arm, with unfavourable outcomes, so there's only 34 of these, and these are the breakdown of the reasons for these two groups. So in summary, SHINE found that 4 months of treatment was as good as standard 6 months of treatment for children presenting with minimal TB. And there were, well, I thought, surprisingly few unfavourable outcomes in both arms overall. Most children did very well in the trial and with excellent retention at 72 weeks. In terms of adverse reactions, I've not shown the data, but there were very few of these. And remembering these are standard TB drugs with a known safety profile. So in conclusion, these results are applicable for the majority of children with TB who present with minimal disease, and shorter treatment period means lower costs both to families and health systems. And there's a formal health economic analysis currently underway. And guideline and policymakers should consider moving to the 4-month treatment for children with non-severe TB. And the WHO are updating the pediatric treatment guidelines early next year, and the SHINE data will be used to inform that review. Okay, so nearly at the end. So it's obviously SHINE is a huge collaboration and too many people to acknowledge, but except always first study participants and families, the trial teams at all the sites and the committees. And just to finish with a reminder, when we could meet face to face, we had a happy sunny day for our last trial management group meeting in Zambia back in 2018. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So I see Willem already has his hand up. Can't quite see all the hands, but Willem, please ask your question.
Thank you very much. Angela, thank you very much for that presentation. I just, I may have missed it, and I know that you had to rush through this, but how was minimal TB diagnosed or defined? And then, and would that ever be practical on a, you know, for implementation? That's my question.
Yeah, and that's probably the most important question. We've had it repeatedly asked each time these results have been presented. So minimal TB in this context is smear negative. All children had 2 respiratory samples. And so smear negative, non-severe TB as severe TB being ruled out based on a chest x-ray. In terms of implementing the results, you're right, this is something that is going to be the challenge moving forward. We've been thinking about that, particularly with the potential for smears to be becoming less common and perhaps not everywhere doing chest x-rays. But I think in terms of one approach could be that you would be treating for 4 months and then looking to see how well the child is doing for whether to continue for 6 months or not. I don't know whether, I think Anna took over, the trial physician is on the line. I don't know whether Anna wants to say any more about implementing these results.
I guess Anna is on the line and has her hand up. So Anna.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I'd like just to add, non-severe TB, as Angela has mentioned, the severity of TB is a published kind of resource of TB severity classification by Catherine Wiseman. That's what we use. And we limited it to very common forms of TB. Most common it is intrathoracic, but less than one lobe, and without kind of major complications like clinically evident airway obstruction from intrathoracic lymph node TB, and extrathoracic, which is quite common in children, which is peripheral lymph node TB. So these are the forms that make up around 2/3 of TB cases in children. And that's why this is a vast majority. We will work hard in terms of like reassuring clinicians, but it's mainly the chest X-ray is required to ensure like you're dealing with not missing very severe TB. And also, like, children are clinically kind of like, well, not completely very sick, though in the trial we did have, I can't say we had only well children in the trial, because some of them and HIV positive were quite sick. In terms of smear negativity, we did have a gene experts in few children, in all children done, and in those where some of them were gene expert positives. And when we looked in the correlation, because unfortunately we don't have a data available just yet about the all screened children with smear positivity, I think that would be something interesting to look at. But among those smear negative who were recruited in the trial, all of them had gene expert, those who had gene expert positive, they were low or very low semi-quantitative results. So, and I'm probably aware that, there is a correlation between smears and gene expert positivity in terms of CT, like the cycle threshold, or with semi-quantitative results. So I just think whether this is the way forward, but further data, maybe like, real life data is required, whether treatment shortening in the majority of kids can be used regardless of smears.
Thank you, Anna. And I think I will encourage, obviously, offline conversations. Willem, if you have follow-up questions. I see Muhlopeni's hand is up.
Hi, thank you. My question is to Matthew. So I wanted to check if amongst the collection of your small molecules, do you have those that potentially could target the hosts or more with immunomodulatory effects in addition to those targeting the bacterium? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're so interested in that series of molecules that I showed, is because if we can confirm that there is this activity against non-replicating TB, then potentially we're talking about a host-directed effect. Yeah, and I find that extremely interesting for the obvious reason that if you could derive small molecules that act on the host and are effective, then you can deal head-on with the idea of trying to find a molecule which is less susceptible to the development of resistance, which would be amazing. So mechanisms of action involving the host is something I'm really interested in and would love to pursue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Marc, your hand was up, and now
Yes, indeed. Question for Rob. There seem to be elements in all three presentations of how do you change standard perceptions. So in other words, shortened drug treatment in a very entrenched area, the idea of open source management of drugs and production, which is not what people usually do. So Rob, what advice are you going to give the other two speakers?
Thank you, Marc. It's a really interesting question. Well, I think the thing is, as humans, we do change our minds about things. And even unless you're perhaps in 10% of people who have fixed ideas that are there for a particular other reason, I'm thinking of vehement anti-vax and flat earther type beliefs. But apart from that relatively small number of people, I think we all as humans will change our view if the story is convincing enough. So what we need to do is to be able to look at what the people that you're trying to change currently think about the object. So if it's the use of small molecules or open source, drugs, what are they currently thinking? And two sets of beliefs are really important. Necessity beliefs, do they really feel they need to change? And concerns, what's the downside of changing? So by understanding the way in which people currently think about it, that can help you to make a case, a different story that can interact with those two beliefs. And obviously you also have to understand the value systems and incentives, some of which may be perverse, about why someone might want to stick to their view. So for example, big molecule producers, I feel like it was Turin in Matt's amazing stuff on pyrimethamine, you know, they had a massive incentive for continuing to believe that you needed to charge huge amounts of money for a so-called patent on an old drug. So, you know, you may not be able to change them, but you can change everyone around them. And I think the example of getting the kids, I think it was, to synthesize the drugs for pennies was just a brilliant way of doing that. So, you know, we are open to persuasion. You just got to know how, and you've got to know how people are currently thinking about the thing. And that's the sort of approach and principle that we're applying in both RID and impact.
Excellent. Anyone else want to add maybe to a response to Mark's question? Angela, Matt, just 1 minute.
I just think what you said, Rob, is it's really fascinating. And I guess you must be asked, or must be thinking about how you convince, this is slightly off topic, how you convince people to take new COVID vaccines. I guess there must be an issue there.
That is very much on the agenda, though I'm not really a vaccines researcher. I deal mainly with pharmaceuticals, but I have starting to get involved in that issue, and we're starting to do some studies. And just as an aside, very pleased to meet you, Matt, even though we work in the same school. We've never met.
Photos of this, isn't it?
So great, well done. You're bringing people together, Lele.
Okay, on that note, I think, thank you very much. Brilliant set of short talks. I think it's now time for the next session, led by Maddie. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Lele. Great, so I think this is the final session before we have a roundup and general discussion. There are two speakers in this session, and we're going to start with Helen Spencer. Helen, I'm afraid I don't think we've met in person before, but it's a great pleasure to introduce you. Helen is a respiratory paediatrician and the clinical lead for the lung transplant service at Great Ormond Street Hospital, with an interest, I think, mainly in cystic fibrosis. Is going to tell us about phage therapy in this setting.
Thanks. I'm honoured to be in a room with so many bright and brilliant people, so thanks for the opportunity to tell you about our work. Here's the title of my talk, When the Antibiotics Don't Work, What Next? The background is, so I'm a lung transplant physician, and we had a 15-year-old girl with CF who'd been on Mycobacterium abscessus maciliense treatment for 8 years prior to her lung transplant, which happened in September 2017. As with many abscessus isolates, completely resistant to all antibiotics. But we undertook the operation, and at the time we do a mediastinal lymph node clearance, and we try to remove all infection if possible, and we do a cavity washout with amikacin. And she had an uncomplicated post-operative period and was extubated quite early. We continued antibiotics for a couple of months, and we do bronchoscopies and lavage to look for evidence of infection, and everything seemed to be clear. This is a really busy slide, and I'm sorry for that, but it shows you the 13 patients with Mycobacterium abscessus that we've transplanted at Great Ormond Street, and with varying success. I'll just show you the main thing to look at is the subspecies here. So we've transplanted Balletti, maciliense, and then various abscessus patients. The red patients, unfortunately, are the patients who have gone on and died. And initially, we thought it was majorly a problem with abscessus, and we stopped transplanting those patients. And then we had these two patients transplanted in quick succession. And I'm going to talk to you about this girl here, the patient in yellow who had maciliense. So we knew that if you got recurrence of growth post-transplant, that heralded really bad news, and that explains why we undertook some experimental therapy for her. So this is the situation we're in, 8 months post-transplant. This girl was in big trouble. She had disseminated infection of the lung, so positive abscesses in her sputum. This is her sternal wound, where you can see she got infection here. She had a massive node at her porta hepatis, and this is a PET scan which shows a large hotspot here, which is just shown in a different plane here, which you can see the lesion here. She also had a hotspot in her sternum, which you can see here, and then started to develop multiple skin nodules. So at that point, she was sent home on palliative care. But Mum asked the question, what about phage therapy? And so I talked to our microbiologist, James Suthill, who had done his PhD on phages. And for those of you who aren't aware, bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria. They're host dependent. They insert their own genetic material into the bacteria, and they're host specific. They're tiny, and they can be lytic or either temperate, and this becomes important when we think about treatment. And they're old and they're vast. So in terms of the cell cycle, this can be either lytic, which is what you want, or temperate. So in terms of lytic growth, the virus inserts its DNA and then causes cell lysis, whereas with lysogeny, it inserts its DNA and then just sort of hangs around and doesn't actually kill the bacteria. And what you see on the bacterial plaques, so you'll see a clear plaque if you've got a lytic phage, and you'll see a turbid plaque if you've got a temperate phage. So we approached the Pittsburgh team, University of Pittsburgh, and Graham Hatfull, who's been working on mycobacterium phages for about 20 years. And we asked them whether or not they had any phages which could treat her particular isolate. And they actually looked for those 2 patients that I talked about, and they screened their phages and they looked for new phages. And this was going on behind the scenes, and within 2 months they'd identified 1 good phage, which was lytic, and they found 2 other temperate phages, which they then genetically engineered to make also lytic. So this was happening behind the scenes, and what was happening to my poor patient? Well, she had more disseminated infection. She drew me this picture to show where all of her skin nodules were. This was the site on the arm that we biopsied and found Mycobacterium abscessus, and she had various nodules all over her body. And as you can see, the clamshell incision was showing there as a breakdown. So we then had a conference call between the Great Ormond Street team, the Pittsburgh phage team led by Graham Hatfull, and then Robert Schooley, who's a professor of infectious diseases at University of San Diego, and he'd treated a patient with resistant Acinetobacter baumannii and had good results with that. And so he came in on the call, and they told me they had these 3 phages which could kill the bacteria for my patient, and we agreed to try it. So these are the 3 phages. One was called Muddy, and then these 2 others, Zoe and BPS, which were genetically engineered, and they'd removed the repressor gene to make those lytic phages. And as you can see, we had, with all 3 phages, we had complete clearance of the bacteria. So the process from that conference call to getting it to our patients took 12 weeks, and it was a pretty complex process. We had to notify the MHRA that we were intending to import something. We then had to clarify about GMO status. We had to appoint a biological safety officer at our hospital. We had to undertake QA, the hospital QA requirements, because this was going from a lab directly to a patient. We involved the cell therapy labs about how the phage was going to be prepared. And what we were worried about massive cell lysis, whether or not she would have a massive allergic response, and then we were worried about the immune response and whether or not there'd be an impact on the lung graft, and what would happen to her. And then we're worried, would the phage find the mycobacterium and kill it? Would there be phage resistance? So lots of issues and things that we're worried about. So we went ahead and we initially gave it topically to the sternal wound that I showed you, and then we proceeded to give an increasing dose of the phage cocktail. This is her first PET scan pre-transplant. I showed you that big nodule at the portohepatis and the sternal wound infection. This is activity in the kidneys, which is normal. And what we found 6 weeks post.
And I'm really sorry to interrupt you because I'm on tender hooks to know what happens, but we're just a bit short of time. So just to remind you.
So this is the last PET scan that shows that node had cleared, the skin lesions that you could see all over the body had cleared. And so at the moment, all the skin lesions have cleared up. The node at the portohepatis has cleared. And so phage treatment has been safe, and she seems to have responded to it. I think this provides opportunities. What's interesting for NTM infection is whether or not everybody's interested in TB, and whether or not this could be something that could be used for patients with TB. It was safe for our patient. It was extremely well tolerated, and I shall finish there in terms of time and acknowledge the huge team which helped me look after my patient. Thank you.
Many thanks, Helen. It's a really, really interesting story. So I'm going to just ask people to hold fire on their questions, and then we can come back after the next speaker and address the questions for this as well. So great. If I could ask you to stop sharing your screen and invite Rishi Gupta to share his. Rishi is the last speaker this morning and is a respiratory trainee who is undertaking an NIHR clinical fellowship as part of his PhD. And Rishi's a data scientist who's been bringing together lots of different hierarchies of data together to help decision making in tuberculosis. Over to you, Rishi.
Thanks, Maddie. Are my slides showing okay?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of Periscope TB, which is essentially a personalized risk predictor tool for future tuberculosis and is aimed for use in settings with low transmission. So I'll start with some brief background. So it's often estimated that 1/4 of the world's population are sensitized to NTB and therefore potentially at risk of developing TB disease. However, we know from previous data that the risk of TB among people with what we call latent infection, and we define this either using a tuberculin skin test or an interferon gamma release assay, is only approximately 1 to 5% over a 2-year interval among most adult risk groups. So that means that if we were to treat everybody with a positive latent TB test with full preventative treatment, we would probably need to treat somewhere in the region of 20 to 100 people in order to prevent a single incident TB case. So this clearly still represents a huge challenge when the treatment for latent infection currently involves up to 3 months of antibiotics. In addition, we also know that the risk of TB is very likely to vary significantly between individuals with latent infection. So simply providing the same blanket advice that we hear so often of a 5 to 10% lifetime risk of disease for anyone with a positive test is very likely to be inaccurate for most. So it would be great to find a way to do better here by developing new tools to improve how we risk stratify people with latent TB infection so that we can then hope to deliver our preventative therapy more precisely and to those who need it the most. And this issue is the focus of my PhD and my work on Periscope TB. So the idea behind Periscope is that the latent TB test result provides limited information in isolation, but we might be able to gain much more information by interpreting that test result within the context of the patients in front of us, i.e. here accounting for their demographics, their history of TB exposure, and some measures of their immune function. So to address this, we started by performing a systematic review in order to identify studies that have tested people for latent TB and then followed them up to identify who is then diagnosed with active TB disease. And we focused here on settings with low transmission to limit the risk of reinfection during follow-up. We then invited the authors of these eligible studies to contribute individual participant data, which we pulled from over 80,000 individuals. We then use this pooled data set to firstly examine the risk of TB amongst some of the risk groups in the data set, such as recent contacts and recent migrants. And we then use the subset of the full data to develop and validate our personalized prognostic model, which we call Periscope TB. And this is now hosted at periscope.org. It's applicable, as I mentioned, for settings with low TB transmission. And the tool integrates age, a quantitative latent TB test result, a patient's TB exposure history, and a history of either HIV or transplant receipt in order to derive a personalized TB risk estimate. And so the purpose of this is really to facilitate shared decision-making between clinicians and people who are tested for latent TB infection when they're considering initiation of preventative treatment. So we're really trying to move away from the idea of blanket advice of a 5 to 10% lifetime risk for all, and instead towards individualized risk estimates and decision making. On the right here, I included a screenshot so you can see what the online tool interface looks like. After entering the input parameters that are required, you can then generate a report like this, which you can download from the patient's records if needed. And I really want to stress here that we see this as an iterative process, and I think there is huge scope for extending the work, in particular trying to make it applicable towards higher transmission settings. And I'd be really delighted to discuss these possibilities across the UCL-TB network and beyond for anyone who might be interested. And I'll end there by acknowledging the huge number of people involved in this work, particularly my PhD supervisors, Marc, and Ibrahim, the research funders, and to Alexei Yavlinsky, who built the Periscope website. For anyone who's interested, you can find full details in the publication signposted here. So thank you all very much for listening, and I'll look forward to further discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Rishi. So it's 11:40, and I think perhaps Marc, you could guide me about whether you want us to continue with a little bit of discussion on these.
Let's have 3-5 minutes of discussion, and then we can focus down the last session with Tim. Thank you.
Great, fabulous. Willem, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I really like the risk score, but I'm going to ask a difficult question. How are you going to get this implemented globally in low transmission areas?
Yeah, so thank you for a really important question. So at the moment, we're sort of at the outset, if you like, of our dissemination phase. So we're obviously trying to publicize as much as we can in terms of the actual the science that the tool is based upon. But I agree that then the next step is to really try to implement as broadly as possible. One advantage we have here is that we established a really wide and collaborative network in order to actually pool the data and do the work. So we pooled data from 18 studies done in 20 countries, meaning that we sort of have advocates locally in many of the low transmission settings where our study data sets came from. And a lot of our collaborators have been extremely proactive in terms of promoting use through their networks locally. So I hope that we can continue to sort of take advantage of those networks and to disseminate broadly as a result, and also then to use that as a platform for extending further prospectively.
Thank you, Rishi. Anna Turkova.
Thank you for fascinating talks, and I have a question to Helen and a question to Rishi. So Helen, you know, we used phages in Russia a long time ago, and especially for resistant gastrobacteria. I think they're still used in Central Asia, in Russia, in that region, and quite widely. I think it's quite an interesting potential drugs for a resistant TB, where, like, you know, no drugs available to treat kids and adults. So, but I wanted to ask you, because, you know, for gastrobacteria, we used to give it orally. You know, for disseminated TB, what is the route of administration, and how is easy to transport and store phages? Because as far as I remember, they need refrigerator and probably, like, you know, are vulnerable to light exposure. And the second question, sorry, just like, so finish. Rishi, is your calculator available now through this publication so we can play with that in our clinics?
If I can ask Helen first, and then Rishi can come back with.
Yeah, I think it depends where the disease is. So phages, as you're probably aware, have been applied in all sorts of ways. So they've been applied topically. I think this was on one of the first patient who received it IV, but we also talked about using it nebulized. But it's been used in burns patients. It's been used in Pseudomonas ear infections and things like that. So you can put it on topically, but I think it depends where the disease is. And this was the issue with our patient is that, she had disseminated infection. It wasn't just a skin infection, and that's why I went for IV, because it was affecting the lung, affecting the soft tissue. They're tricky to work with, you're right. And the other issue is that they're species specific. So I talked about the two patients. They both had Abscessus massiliense, but only one patient could we find phage. So even with a species, it can be really difficult, and it's hard work to trawl through all the phages to try and find something that's going to work. But for those really drug-resistant infections, I think it could be a suitable treatment.
Great, thank you, Rishi.
Sure. Yes, and to clarify, the tool is publicly available at periscope.org, so feel free to have a look and get in touch with any feedback.
Brilliant. That's 11:45.
Thank you.
Marc, I'm sure we can continue the discussion, but maybe you'd like to move on to the general discussion.
Yes, please. And I'd like to invite Tim to lead on that. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, Maddie, and thanks everybody for a fascinating morning. And so my task in these last 15 minutes is to just try and encourage us to think a little bit about how UCL-TB might work going forward. And in the spirit of the day, I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you see? What can you see, Marc?
You at the moment.
You don't want to see me. You want to see this.
I'm seeing a very smiley Maddie. Yay!
So hopefully you can see a famous clip. There's Kirk Douglas, and you'll. So at the beginning of the tour of the sessions this morning, I'm going to chide you a little bit, Marc, because you were talking about UCL-TB in terms of we and you. And that made me think about this famous scene from the film Spartacus. And if I can click my screen, you'll see that, in fact, everybody who's here should be joining me in the phrase, I am UCL-TB. Because that's really what this session is about. It is looking at how we as a community come together to address TB. So I hope that's the message. And so to go back to the text that we're trying to think about is really the question is, what do we want to achieve? And you'll see on the screen some ideas. It's a question of what we can maximize within UCL. And there's a list of suggestions of things which we might want to do. Already today, we've identified some new synergies between groups and some new projects that might emerge. I've been reminded of a couple of projects which I need to revitalize a little bit. And also there's a question about what we maximize, how we present ourselves externally. So I'm not going to use these 15 minutes for me to tell you everything about what I think, but I just wanted to try and spark conversation with a couple of thoughts. And I think it'd be fair to say that largely our presentations today have been on the biomedical model, although there's been inputs from other areas which are great. So ask the question, well, what are we trying to achieve? And I'd suggest there's two themes here. One is the one which many of us are focused on, which is the practical output of improving treatment, management, and outcomes for TB patients. And obviously that's a laudable and is the focus, particularly those of you who are clinicians in the group, that's particularly important. But I also wonder, and this year of all years gives us a reason to think about the other element, which is whether we can use TB as a model for, and forgive me if this is a naive term, but for the human experience, whether we can use our learning and knowledge of tuberculosis to inform the wider community. And obviously with the advent of another respiratory pandemic, infectious pandemic, a lot of our TB experience has been repurposed for challenging the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd just like to pose those ideas to you as a community and to see whether you have any thoughts on those. And then thinking about that, addressing these questions about how we maximise what we do within UCL and maximise how we present ourselves externally and to what aim. So I'm going to stop talking and hope that somebody will put their hand up. Of course, we're all exhausted at this stage, but Marc, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Tim. That question about what we try and do within UCL, one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do, the people on the call, and thank you again for giving your morning to this, is to email us. I think the chat function doesn't work, unfortunately, on here. So if you could email UCL-TB and tell us how you found this, just briefly, bullet points, whatever, what you would like us to do going forward, and what sort of things, as Tim, I really liked your slide, by the way, what you as to UCL-TB people want us to do, who are your support structure for you. And that's both within UCL. I mean, the talks were far too short, as you know, and that's all my fault, but I just wanted you to have a flavour of things. But also how you might want us to reach out to people externally. It is incredible if you like, the force of UCL that we have without even realising it, because we're based here. So in other words, we can contact other research institutions or clinical services or whoever you like, policymakers, and actually we can connect people. So tell us what you want is really important to us.
Yeah, thanks, Marc. I think that's really important. I think there's an element. From, if you like, the core group, which that we feel that we have a narrow perspective, and we'd like to widen that perspective. But again, that's if people want that, and I think that's quite important. And I think it's important for us. I would suggest it's important for us to widen that perspective in a robust and academic way. One of the things I feel conscious of is, particularly as we move into behavioural sciences and the edges of my knowledge, that I'm an amateur in those areas. So I might know quite a bit about growing TB in a laboratory, but there's whole areas where there's specialists within UCL who could contribute to those conversations. And you know, the work that I think about, the clinical trials work that we do with Angela and the people at the CTU. Outside of that is a huge amount of information that could be gathered that would be interesting and useful to the wider community. Maddie.
Thanks, guys. I think it's really helpful to have brought everybody together to have this, just to listen to the array of things that are going on. And I would really like to see a more regular exercise where we actually devote time to being able to go into particular threads of work in more detail, so that we can have a multidisciplinary discussion and then carve out going forward the sort of multidisciplinary collaborative approach to trying to add value to these projects. And I think I'd be really interested to hear, if we were to arrange such a thing, whether there would be general interest in people attending, not to talk about all of the array of projects that are going on in 5-minute slots, but actually to devote an hour a month, let's say, to individual projects where everybody chips in with their views and their expertise about what they could do.
Thanks, Marty. I would vote for that. I think that's a really great idea. The opportunity to get your teeth into an area is important. I think I would appreciate that.
I mean, if we needed a tag name, I'd call it the UCL-TB lab meeting.
I think that's what it's called then. Great, thanks. Matt, Todd, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think that idea is a really good one, and you know, so short and frequent talks are really good. Maybe including, you know, ECRs and people like that who could talk about the research they're doing. I had a question about UCL-TB membership. In the sense, I could imagine. So we have Public Health England here, but mostly I think the people on the call are UCL based, and I wondered whether people have thought about inviting select others from outside of UCL into the group. So, for example, people from the private sector or people from, you know, granting agencies as guests and things like that to sort of broaden the conversation. I mean, you know, I was thinking the other day about what the new Google AlphaFold program can do for predicting protein structures that might be relevant for TB research. And they're just a few blocks away from us in the School of Pharmacy. You know, people like that who might bring an outsider's perspective or bring projects that we might be interested in. I just wanted about membership.
So Neil, do you want to respond to that? Because you're the person who's been working on membership most recently.
Well, I've been working on adding them. It's not my decision. We do have some. So at the moment, it's been it's kind of, there are guidelines and it's a little bit loose. My understanding is that membership of UCL-TB is people who have some sort of formal link to UCL, and you're quite loose about how you define that. But I think I have to pass that to others in terms of people who don't have a formal link to UCL. And it seems to me that part of the point of this is that it should be people. Part of it, this is us telling the world what UCL does. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't interact with other people in particular ways, but I'm not sure about membership. I do think that we should try and get as many people as possible within UCL involved. And we do have several people from the PHE. We have people in Germany, we have people around and about. So it isn't just people on the UCL campus, but someone like Marc or one of the other members should answer that.
Yeah, Marc's put his hand up, so perhaps he'll.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing, isn't it? This idea of what's membership and then why can't you just join into things? And actually, this first meeting, we thought, because we weren't really sure how it would go and what we wanted to do, and we sort of wanted actually to reach out within UCL, we sort of restricted it to the sort of membership of UCL-TB or of UCL. But actually, that will all change. And in fact, if we use your model, Matt, of actually being much more open, which is what we believe very strongly in, the idea would be that going forward, we invite more people in. In fact, it's open to anybody. That would be a very attractive idea, because, as you say, the rapid development of any project is going to be based on enthusiasm, and it isn't just going to be confined to UCL. And if we see, if we are open and aware of what's out there, then I think we'll really profit from that. So I'd see going forward, actually, we'd probably change the structure a bit.
Great, thanks, Marc. Anna took over. You put your...
Yes, I completely agree with Marc. I think, you know, we need to be open and invite experts in similar areas that will just, you know, promote projects and generate new ideas. So I would really welcome that.
Thanks. Whilst I remember, On the issue of bacteriophages and the former Soviet Union, of course, there's the Bacteriophage Institute in Tbilisi, which was the international centre, but overlooked largely by the West, and the outputs from there, possibly because they were written in Russian mainly. So that's always an interest to me. So Anita Roche, you put your hand up for a moment. Hello, Anita. You want to say something, or were you just...
Sorry, I think that was a technical issue, but it's been a fascinating morning for me, and I really value the kind of openness and sharing of the group, and I think the work that's happening is fantastic, but I think there always is a little added value if you can be kind of inclusive, and more than happy to support in any way we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. Neil, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, I suppose I was just thinking...
a bit rude, sorry, I didn't mean again, I meant...
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking about one of the roles that we should be playing. It is trying to support people in complicated multidisciplinary grants, and that will include people obviously within UCL and outside of UCL. But I think it's something that we can certainly help, and we'd welcome your input as to how we might do that.
Great, thanks, Neil. I think that's really the key message is how can we are all UCL-TB, but how can we use this organisation to forward our aims as a community, and with our focus on mycobacterial diseases. So my clock on my computer has just ticked 12 o'clock. I'm going to give Marc a minute or two to wrap up, as he started the day and is the director of UCL-TB. So I'll go to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you again to all our speakers for giving your time, being forced into doing a very short talk, which meant distilling the key elements. Thanks in particular to Willem and everybody who joined us from AHRI. It was super, really just shows the breadth of engagement, and also that tuberculosis just touches everywhere, and the issues are so relevant in whichever setting one is operating. As I said, this is the first of what we hope will be a regular event. We can change the formatting. We can do really whatever you, as part of UCL-TB, want us to do. Please do email us, email UCL-TB, let us know how this meeting went. As you can see, we've already, as a result of it, we're going to set up a UCL-TB lab meeting. All welcome, tell people about it, do join, do become a member. The advantage of that for you, I think, is that we will engage with you even more. You'll get bombarded with emails. What else could you possibly want? Let's face it. And thank you for dealing with the technology. I'll leave you again with that comment of John Mullan's earlier in the morning, which was he was delighted to see that scientists struggle with technology. And of course, science is now so much at the fore of the public mind in terms of COVID that we hope we don't get lost. But it's so important to have the arts and humanities to keep us human. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and I look forward to getting your feedback. And thanks again to participants and the people who've put it together. Bye-bye.